In the quiet of an editing room, truth does not disappear in a burst of fire or a final gunshot. It vanishes in small clicks, a scene lifted here, a line trimmed there, a character softened until their edges no longer hurt. In the late 80s and 90s, audiences thought they were just watching another wave of American action films built on one-liners, explosions, and disposable villains. But behind the smoke and broken glass, something else was happening. Directors were walking away from their own movies. Actors were being pushed forward or erased to satisfy a marketing plan. Entire storylines were stripped out to make a star look cleaner, a studio safer, a message quieter. Some of these films slipped straight to video, some were buried by bad reviews, and some were disowned by the very people who made them. Yet if you look closely in the rough cuts and in the stories nobody promoted, you can still see what they tried to hide. These are the 5 films that revealed what Hollywood tried to hide. Film 1, The Glimmer Man, 1996. The story begins with a shadow that never should have been touched. The Glimmer Man was meant to be darker, stranger, almost spiritual, a thriller shaped around trauma, faith, and the quiet brutality of a man trying to outrun what he once was. Steven Seagal stepped into the role with a character that originally carried layers of mysticism and a violent past the script confronted directly. But somewhere between the set and the cutting room, the film that audiences were promised became something entirely different. Scenes involving religious symbols, past missions, and unsettling moments of moral conflict vanished. What remained was a slimmer, softer version of a movie that had once dared to go further. The surface suggested a buddy cop thriller paired with Keenan Ivory Wayans for contrast and levity, a formula the studio believed was safer. Marketing pushed it as a standard action piece, fast, loud, familiar, while ignoring what the early drafts and original cut had tried to explore. Characters were reshaped in post-production. Motivations became vague. A storyline involving a serial killer and deeper government involvement was pared down until it barely connected to the film's original spine. What was once intended as a meditation on a man torn between violence and redemption became an awkward hybrid of tones. Behind the scenes, tension simmered. Reports circulated about disagreements over tone cuts demanded by executives and scenes removed to avoid pushing the rating into dangerous territory. The film that reached theaters was not the film its creators believed they were making. The edges were sanded down until the risk disappeared, and so did the meaning. What survives now is an echo of the version that might have been a reminder that sometimes the loudest action comes from what is taken away rather than what remains. Film 2, Fire Down Below, 1997. It was supposed to be Steven Seagal's most personal film, a story about corruption, poisoned towns, and the quiet war fought by people no one listens to. Early drafts painted a bleak, grounded narrative about environmental destruction and the machinery of power that protects it. Seagal envisioned a film that leaned heavily into investigation, community bonds, and a slow, burning moral unraveling. But once production began, the film entered a tug of war it could never escape. Every time a scene pushed too close to political discomfort or emotional depth, another hand reached in to pull it back. On the surface, the movie was marketed as a traditional Seagal action vehicle, one man standing against corporate evil, delivering justice with speed and certainty. Trailers leaned on explosions, fistfights, and a mysterious past he carried like a scar. The rural Kentucky setting was framed as a backdrop for heroism rather than the centerpiece of a community under threat. What audiences were shown was only the top layer of a story that had been far more ambitious before the cuts began. Behind the curtain, an entire version of the film disappeared. Warner Bros. Reportedly removed close to a third of the footage, reshaping the entire narrative. Subplots involving local families, political pressure, and the emotional weight of environmental collapse were stripped away. Scenes that fleshed out relationships, particularly those meant to deepen Seagal's connection to the townspeople, were trimmed until they served only as transitions between action beats. Even the villain's motivations were simplified, turning a nuanced systemic critique into a familiar good versus evil frame. Crew members spoke quietly about rewrites on set, studio notes arriving daily and sequences reshot to lighten the tone. What could have been Siegel's most grounded performance became a patchwork of fragments, some earnest, some forced, none allowed to breathe. In the end, Fire Down Below stands as a film hollowed by caution, a reminder that sometimes the strongest scenes are the ones no audience is ever allowed to see. Film 3, The Punisher 1989. In another lifetime, The Punisher could have been the film that redefined the comic book anti-hero before the genre ever found its modern shape. The original cut opened with a sequence that grounded Frank Castle in grief, rage, and the slow suffocation of a man who had lost everything. Dolph Lundgren's performance leaned into silence, cruelty, and a fractured sense of justice that bordered on nihilism. But the world never saw that version. Before the film could speak for itself, a series of decisions behind closed doors reshaped it into something smaller, something louder, something safer. The surface that audiences received was marketed as a retro action vehicle, a lone warrior carving through the criminal underworld with cold precision. Posters promised relentless gunfire, leather-clad vengeance, and a hero who barely spoke. The film never reached U.S. theaters, an oddity that only deepened the myth surrounding it. Internationally, it found life as a straight-to-video curiosity framed as yet another late 80s crime thriller rather than the broken soul character study it was meant to be. Hidden beneath that trimmed exterior was a far more complicated struggle. Financial conflict between the studio and distributor froze its theatrical debut. Entire story threads were cut, including an opening that charted Castle's fall from family man to ghost. Scenes intended to humanize him, conversations, memories, moments where violence cracked open something fragile were removed to emphasize action pacing. There were whispers of alternate edits of reels left in storage of a darker tone that executives believed would alienate audiences. Even Lundgren himself spoke about the emotional beats that vanished between the script and the final cut, replaced by sequences that made the characters simpler but emptier. In the end, The Punisher became a film built from pieces rather than a vision held together not by story but by compromise. It exists today like an unfinished confession, a reminder of how much a character can lose when the truth of his transformation is buried in the edits no one was ever meant to question. Film 4, Let's Get Harry 1986. The story of Let's Get Harry does not begin with gunfire or an abduction or a group of ordinary men pushed into extraordinary violence. It begins with a filmmaker walking away from his own creation. Stuart Rosenberg, the director behind Cool Hand, Luke watched his film reshaped so dramatically that he refused to let his name stand beside it. In its place appeared the most infamous signature in Hollywood, Alan Smithee, the alias used only when a director feels their work has been taken from them. That alone tells you everything about what happened behind the curtain. On the surface, the studio sold Let's Get Harry as a patriotic rescue thriller. A group of everyday Americans journey into cartel territory to save a kidnapped friend, with Mark Harmon placed front and center as the newly promoted hero. Posters and trailers emphasized his presence, framing him as the film's emotional core. Yet in the original version, Harmon was not the protagonist. He was barely more than a narrative spark, someone whose disappearance set the story in motion. The film was never meant to be about him. The hidden truth is the studio wanted a different movie, one with a more marketable star. Executives demanded new scenes featuring Harmon, rewritten lines, and entire sequences dedicated to boosting his visibility. These additions fractured the original tone, shifting the film away from a grounded exploration of brotherhood, desperation, and moral gray areas. Rosenberg's story of ordinary men thrown into an impossible situation became something cleaner, brighter, and far less honest. Cast and crew members spoke quietly about how the reshoots disrupted the emotional balance, turning a raw drama into a mismatched hybrid of genres. What remains today is a film with two identities, the one its director made and the one the studio forced into being. The final cut feels torn between truth and image, sincerity and marketability. And somewhere between those two versions lies the film Rosenberg hoped audiences would see, one that no longer exists except in memory's production notes and the silence of a name erased by its own creator. Film 5 Catchfire/Backtrack 1990. Some films are haunted long before they reach an audience, and Catchfire, later rebranded as Backtrack, is one of the clearest examples. What began as Dennis Hopper's attempt to create a stylish, eccentric thriller soon dissolved into one of Hollywood's most contentious battles between vision and control. Hopper poured himself into the project, shaping a film that was deliberately strange, dreamlike, and unpredictable. But as tensions mounted during production, the studio stepped in, notes multiplied, and the director realized the movie he was making was slipping away from him piece by piece. In the end, Hopper did something drastic. He removed his name from his own film, and in its place, like a quiet gravestone marking a creative loss, appeared the alias Alan Smithy. The surface version, the one released under Backtrack, looked like a straightforward thriller about a woman on the run and the hitman who becomes obsessed with her. The studio leaned heavily on star power, emphasizing Jodie Foster and Dennis Hopper, while pushing the marketing toward chase scenes and neon-lit tension. The final runtime was just under 100 minutes, tight and commercial-shaped, to fit a template the studio believed would sell. To most viewers, it passed as an offbeat but familiar thriller, nothing more. But hidden underneath was the truth. Hopper had originally delivered a cut running over 3 hours. His version explored trauma, surreal identity, and an almost hypnotic bond between the leads. Strange rhythms, long silences, and experimental sequences were carved out until the film's personality was nearly unrecognizable. Entire storylines vanished. Emotional arcs were flattened. The haunting, stylized world Hopper had crafted was replaced by something conventional, and the studio's revisions erased the very soul of the project. Hopper later revived his cut at festivals years later, where the contrast was undeniable. Two films, built from the same footage yet speaking entirely different languages. Today, Catchfire stands as one of Hollywood's clearest warnings about intervention, a reminder that a film can survive, but its identity can be lost long before the credits roll. And like any story rewritten too many times, what remains is only the outline of what once tried to breathe. Bonus fact: The Keep 1983. Long before it became a cult whisper among genre fans, The Keep was meant to be Michael Mann's dark, hypnotic descent into myth and terror. Shot with sweeping atmospheres, smoke-drenched corridors, and a score that pulsed like a heartbeat lost underground, it was envisioned as a 2.5-hour epic, part war story, part supernatural fable, part psychological nightmare. Mann built a world where every frame felt carved from shadow and every character moved like they were being watched by something ancient. But the film that arrived in theaters was not the one he made. It was the one that survived. On the surface, audiences were handed a strange, jagged cut running just over 90 minutes. Characters appeared and vanished without warning. Motivations were unclear. Entire sections seemed torn away mid-scene. Critics dismissed it as incoherent, unaware that the version they saw was essentially a wounded film, missing organs, missing bone. The studio, fearing the length and the unconventional pacing, demanded a severe reduction that amputated Mann's structure and left only fragments of what he had intended. Even the special effects team suffered disasters midway through production, forcing more rewrites and last-second improvisations that further warped the film's shape. Behind the curtain, the truth was even harsher. A catastrophic lab accident destroyed key post-production materials, making it impossible for Mann to restore the original cut. What survived was a compressed echo of a far larger vision, one trapped in limbo, neither fully alive nor fully lost. Fans have searched for the longer version for decades, but the reels simply no longer exist. All that remains are stories from the crew, early script drafts, and hints scattered in the film's rhythm, like the ghost of a heartbeat under stone. The Keep endures as a symbol of what happens when ambition meets circumstance too strange to be supported, too compelling to be forgotten. Some films fail on screen, others were never even allowed to fail. In the end, each of these films stands like a real left, half-exposed, part truth, part illusion, part memory of what was almost allowed to exist. The Glimmer Man lost its shadowed heart. Fire down below surrendered a third of its voice. The Punisher was stripped of the tragedy that made its violence mean something. Let's Get Harry was rebuilt around a man who was never meant to lead it. Catch Fire was carved down until its director no longer recognized the world he had created. And in the background, The Keep lingers like a reminder of how easily a story can vanish in the gap between vision and survival. Each one in its own way reveals the same uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the greatest battles in filmmaking are not fought on screen, but in the edits that decide what the world is permitted to see. These films show how fragile a story becomes when too many hands reach into it, how quickly character turns to outline intention to compromise and art to product. Yet the shadows they leave behind feel strangely alive. They whisper about the scenes that were cut, the endings that were changed, and the versions that live only in rumors and discarded production notes. And maybe that is why they endure. Not because of what they showed, but because of what they weren't allowed to show. Which of these lost versions would you want restored if you had the chance to see just one? And what do you think was truly hidden in the edits no one was supposed to question?